Last week, we studied some of the middle of Genesis chapter 26 and saw how Isaac had been really put through it, that he has been blessed by God in a tremendous way, and then these Philistine men that he had been living beside and lying to suddenly decide they don't want him around, and that the reason for that is not the deception, and it's not anything connected to what he came in for. It's because of the blessing that they decide we can't be around somebody who's living so much better off than we are. And we noted that that's how things tend to go a lot in our lives, that we're doing just fine as long as everybody is down at the same level with us, or if we're above. But if somebody else is above us, we suddenly have a lot of envy, and it causes a lot of problems. And it certainly did for the Philistines, and they tried to make a lot of problems with him as they stopped up 3 wells that his father had dug, and then tried to steal the 2 wells that he dug to replace them. So they keep chasing them throughout this area of Gerar. And we said that he could have squashed them at any time because the king told him, we understand that you're too powerful for us, so we want you to move on. So the king acknowledges he could have stopped them, but instead Isaac models the love of Jesus and decides to show kindness to his enemies, that these people who want to harm him, he instead moves away from them and says, no, I'm not going to fight you over something that God can replace. I'm not going to defend myself when I can move on another direction. And we pointed out at the end there, just to be clear, that God doesn't expect you to be a doormat or especially to be harmed by anyone else who wants your things if God hasn't told you that you need to surrender them. But he does want you to try to make peace, and he told you that he wants you to plan for peace. And so he dug a 6th well at the end of all of this experience, and then he named that and said that God had made room for his family and blessed him. And as we got into the car last week, my wife and I were talking about what we had discussed, and she said, well, I know for sure that God didn't stop at 6. Now, most of us understand what that's about, because if you've heard this story before, you may forget exactly what goes on, but God very rarely stops at the number 6. That is a very unusual circumstance. So for us to stop at 6, you probably are aware that there is, in fact, a 7th well. And so neither is Isaac going to stop at 6. If someone could please read Genesis 26, 23 through 25 for us. 23, chapter 26, 23 through 25.
From there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham. Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well.
Okay, thanks. So Isaac went up to Beersheba. Now, if you're not super familiar with the geography and topography of this region, which probably very few of us are, that doesn't really mean a whole lot to us. We think, okay, well, I went up to Saudi, I went up this way, and I went up that way. But in the Hebrew mind, there's something weird going on here, because he really goes down from Rehoboth, where he has been living, to Beersheba. He's descending in elevation. He's in fact going down about 300 feet in elevation. So that's about the distance from us to the top of Big Ridge. It's not a tremendous amount of elevation, but you usually wouldn't say, I'm going down to Big Ridge. If you're sitting at the bottom of this ridge, you're not going to say that. But if you are familiar with the way that the Jews thought, especially in the ancient world, they definitely had this idea about Jerusalem. When they were talking about Jerusalem, it didn't matter where you are. Anytime you're going to Jerusalem, you're going up to Jerusalem. Every single time. Even if you are on the top of Mount Everest, you would say, hey, I'm going up to Jerusalem. Now, when a Jewish person says this, if you're not a Jewish person, you're probably thinking, that's kind of weird. Why would you say that? Why would a person say they're going up to a place that is below them? Okay, yeah, it could just be a quirk, but I think there's something else going on.
It's Jerusalem.
So in this case, we're talking the area that Isaac's actually living is right here in these foothills, Gerar is right over here, and he's heading to Beersheba. So he's on a pretty small hill, and he's headed towards Beersheba, but he's going down, and he says he's going up. Why would he do that? Okay, have it.
I think it's because Jerusalem is like the spiritual pinnacle.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good word.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's what happens with Jerusalem in the Jewish mind, and it's what happens with Beersheba in the mind of Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob. They know that something special happened here. And so what they're saying is, this is a place where we're going to try to meet God. So anytime we're trying to meet God, we're going up, right? It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter how low or how high you are physically. If you meet God, if his presence is there, you're immediately lifted up to heaven. You're immediately right beside him and equal with him. And that idea in the Jewish mind was very significant to Isaac, and it kept going on in the Old Testament. We'll see even when the prophet Jonah is deep under the ocean, right? He's in the belly of this giant sea monster, and then he cries out to God. So he is significantly below sea level, right? He's way down deep under there. And then he cries out to God. And in that moment, he's instantly lifted into the presence of heaven. He tells us that he's in the belly of Sheol, that he's down with the dead when he's in this monster. And yet when he cries out to God, God answers and lifts him into his presence, even while he's still in the belly of this dark and very horrible place. He went infinitely up, even while he's very far under the ocean. And we certainly remember that that same thing happens in the Psalms, that David tells us, even if I lay down, even if I make my bed in this place of Sheol, there the Spirit of the Lord can find me. So it doesn't matter how far down you are, you will still be able to call on the Lord, and his presence can be there. And many times in our lives, we will find ourselves in a difficult situation where we can barely cope, right? Where we are really not sure how we're going to go on. It could be a problem with your body or your mind or your feelings or your spirit. And in those times, the only solution that really makes sense is to seek God. You shouldn't feel guilty about not seeking God earlier. You shouldn't have this feeling of, oh, well, I shouldn't go to him now because I was supposed to go at the beginning. You should seek him whenever it comes to your heart. Our enemy wants us to feel like there's always a reason to delay prayer. But when you're in a low place in your life, you need to go up to meet God. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. It doesn't matter how hard it is. Call out to God and he will lift you up and you will be in his presence. Isaac had just faced some very difficult days, and so he goes up to meet God. He'd offered peace to his enemies, and now he needs God's peace. He's going up to Beersheba, this place to meet God. Now, we've said it's the same place that Abraham had sought God after a similar situation. We said last week that Abraham had an almost identical problem with these same Philistines. If you read the end of Genesis 21, you will see that he and Abimelech make a covenant. We referenced that last week, where they are arguing over wells in a very similar problem to what Isaac has here. Abimelech was trying to steal Abraham's wells, and God gave him peace. So Abraham digs a well and makes an agreement. Isaac has almost certainly lived through this story, and because of that, he understands what has happened. He's probably been told this many times, because I bet when there's not a whole lot else to do and there's only a few chapters of the Bible that have been lived, you're going to hear those stories again and again. If you think you're familiar with David and Goliath, imagine if you only had the first 15 chapters of Genesis that you were ever able to hear. You're going to know those stories really, really well. So Isaac would have immediately thought, I need to meet God. And I remember where Dad met God. He met him at Beersheba. So that's where I'm going to head. So he's very low. He packed up again, and he digs these wells again and again. Now, dealing with people who want to fight is exhausting, right?
Yes.
If you don't want to fight and somebody else is aggressive, if somebody else just keeps picking at you, keeps trying to irritate you, that just really drains you. Every aspect of your life just starts getting lower and lower and lower, and you feel like you can't do anything about it because every alternative seems to lead to the fight, right? If they want to fight and you don't, it's really difficult if you can't physically remove yourself from that situation If you get really quiet, they're going to have a problem with that. If you say anything, they're going to have a problem with that. If you make a face, they're going to have a problem with that. And Isaac's in this position where he's been quarreling with these guys over and over. And every time Isaac says, okay, you just have it. I'm going to go over here. And then they march up to him and say, oh, no, we want that too. And the exhaustion of that would have gotten him to such an extremely low position. And so he goes to Beersheba because that's where his father had met God. Now, if you think that I may be making too much of this, you'll see that this actually happens again with his son. That Jacob goes to this exact same place and also wants to meet God. We'll see in Genesis 46, 1 through 2, which if we continue a study of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's going to be a long time from now. We covered about 5 chapters in these 12 weeks, so we've got another 20 to go before we get to this story. You'll definitely forget what I'm saying right now by then. But in Genesis chapter 46, we're told, when Israel, that is Jacob, set out on his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob, and he said, here I am. So God meets with 3 generations of the patriarchs in this same spot. It's very obvious to me that these people understand if you want to meet God, this is where you go. But why does God like to meet people in specific places, especially in the Old Testament? Why does he do that? Is there something special about the spots? What's that?
It's religious.
Okay, it's religious. What does that mean?
It means that it's a holy ground.
Okay, it's holy ground. All right. Okay. Okay, so sacrifices have been done there. Okay. So what happens when a place has been a spot where God has been worshipped for a while? Is it different in some way?
It's like the atmosphere has changed drastically. Like, for example, whenever I went to youth camp, you could tell immediately something's different.
Yeah.
How about
Okay.
obedience?
What was that?
Obedience.
Obedience. Okay, so kind of a legacy of obedience, maybe. That the way that Abraham is the source of blessing for his family, that God said, I'll bless to the 1,000th generation because of the obedience of your father. People have been obedient in that spot. Maybe? Or is it different than what you were thinking?
No, that's it.
Okay.
If Leviticus says ground gets unclean, can ground be?
Oh, yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I think that that's very likely what's going on here. It's not ley lines, right? You guys have probably heard of this idea that there's specific things out in the universe, that magnetic influence and the way God created the world, all these powers intersect, and you need to go to those places and use special equipment and special techniques. I don't think that's what's going on. It's not a power center in the physical. I don't think there's anything physically about Beersheba that made it more attractive to God. I think, as what Jenny's saying, is what Deanna's saying, you have these places where you go to meet God, and people go over and over and over. In Beersheba, in Mount Sinai, the tent of meeting, and eventually to Jerusalem, these are all ordinary places, right? If you read the conquest of the Promised Land, Jerusalem's just some city. It's one that they had a hard time getting. It was filled with a lot of wicked people, but it's not really special in any way. There's no indication when you're reading through that conquest, you don't think, oh, well, that's obviously the holy city of God. It's going to be what they fight over for the next 3,000 years. No. What makes Jerusalem special is that God's presence was there, and that the people of God continued to worship him there over and over again. And they're all ordinary places that are made holy because God's holiness was there.
Not like Sodom and Gomorrah.
That's right, kind of the opposite of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? As we said in our Leviticus class, that the land gets polluted and it cries out to you. But Christians don't have specific places we have to go, right? We don't even have to go to a church building. If our government decides that we can't meet together in this place, we can break up into a whole bunch of smaller groups and we can all still pray. We can all still worship God. We can all still study his word together because God doesn't require us to go to a specific place anymore. Now, the reason for that should be pretty obvious to us. Why is that? Why doesn't God ask us to go to a specific place anymore?
Because he's everywhere.
Yeah, he's everywhere. And where is he most? In our hearts, yeah. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. That's what the New Testament tells us. That Everyone had to go to this temple. Everyone had to go to this tent because God's presence was only there. But now you are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Anyone who calls on the name of the Lord is supposed to be holy ground. Every person who walks around calling on Jesus Christ's name is supposed to be the kind of place that Isaac went to. Other people should look at you the way Isaac looked at Beersheba. If you are worshiping and obeying God, his presence should be very obvious to other people. And they should be saying, oh, I need to go get some prayer from that person. I need to go meet with that person. I need them to explain this situation to me. I need their godly wisdom because they should see you as a fountain of the Holy Spirit because you are the temple. You are the holy ground. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go to a specific place. Most Christians have at some time gone to a particular cathedral, gone to a particular shrine, or some place that is very beautiful, very serene, and thought, wow, this is a really holy feeling place. There's nothing wrong with you going to those places. You just don't have to. If it helps you focus your mind, if it helps you focus your heart, go to that place. I find sometimes if I need to really seek God, I'm better off to go to the woods for a little while. I can get distracted very easily from the noise and busyness of the house. If I need to really talk to God, I need some place where there's something I can shut out. But I don't have to do that. If I was locked into a cell, God would provide the grace so that I would be able to meet him anyway. But specific places have helped Isaac. And so he knows, since he is in a low place, that he needs renewal, and he goes to God. Now, in that precious place, the Lord didn't seem to make him wait at all. Verse 24 tells us, that very night, the Lord appeared to him. That's wonderful, right? God knows what we need. There are going to be some times when you are really low, when you really want to seek God, and you will ask him to do something in your life, and he will say nothing. And you will be very frustrated. You may get even angry. And you may say, God, why in the world are you not responding to me in this instant? And God will say nothing. And you will keep railing at God and keep saying, I need this right now. And God knows exactly what you need. So Isaac gets it that night. And if you need it that night, God will talk to you that very moment. But if he knows that you would be better off to wait, that you would be better off to have to press in, he doesn't mind you getting frustrated. He doesn't mind you getting angry. He's just going to wait. And he's going to be the perfect parent because he knows what we need to develop into the people he wants us to be. James 4:8 promises us, come close to God and God will come close to you. It doesn't say a timeline, right? We would love it if it said within 24 hours, if you just pray, God is going to say something to you. But no, it doesn't say even 6 weeks. You may have to keep praying and praying and praying, but come close to God. And he promises he will come close to you. And so he fulfills that promise to Isaac. Isaac didn't know if he was going to meet with God that night, but he knew that God is faithful. And so he goes to Beersheba and he waits for God. God repeated his promises when he spoke to Isaac. He says, I'm going to bless you because of your father's obedience. I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to give you many children. Did God say anything new to Isaac? It's a little deceptive there, because he does say one thing right near the front here. He talks to Isaac, and he says, do not be afraid. And he hasn't said that before. Now that's strange. Because you would think, if God was going to tell you not to be afraid, he would have told you before you were so afraid that you lied to the whole village and got yourself into a big mess, right? Because if you were not afraid then, you wouldn't have lied. And if you were not afraid at all while these other people are chasing you, you probably wouldn't be any lower. But Isaac's gone through the ringer, and now that he's at peace, God says, don't be afraid. Now, that's really interesting to me. God knows that Isaac has struggled with fear, right? He knows that very, very well. He knew that before Isaac understood even what fear was, that Isaac was going to struggle with fear. You can look here at this slide that I've prepared that his entire family, almost everyone connected to Isaac, struggles with fear. There are most of these that is God saying, do not be afraid, but several of them that are other people saying to people in the family, hey, don't be afraid. And it's all kinds of different situations, some very serious, some very silly. And they're being told, don't be afraid in this circumstance, because the whole family has this problem. It's spoken to this family 7 times in the book of Genesis, and then only 5 times in the whole rest of the Torah. That's kind of amazing to me. How our sins can accumulate, how our feelings can accumulate as a family where everybody's acting in the same way, and everybody seems to have this same problem of fear. But the Lord isn't surprised by your struggles. You're going to get into a position where you're thinking, I can't act like mom and dad. They do things so silly. I'm going to walk with God, and I'm not going to have a problem with that. I'm just going to have victory after victory, and there's not going to be any challenge on this issue, because that's the family problem. And then God's going to sit back and say, okay, we'll see how you do. And then you're going to be just like Isaac and just like Jacob and just like their wives even. And you're going to struggle with a lot of those same things, because strongholds of sin tend to collect together, and we tend to share a lot of the same traits in a family. But God knows those weaknesses, and he loves you in spite of them. And if you'll let him, he'll use those weaknesses. He'll take those things that you thought you were incapable of overcoming, and he'll say, okay, we're going to do exactly what you don't want, and we're going to highlight the thing that you're so ashamed of. The Lord is speaking to Isaac not long after his fear has caused him to lie. But we can see here that God is pleased with Isaac's peacemaking, because he doesn't correct or rebuke him, right? When God appears to Isaac, he doesn't say, hey, Isaac, you are stronger than them. What's going on here? I promised to bless you. I promised to protect you. I gave you enough money. You should go and take your army and smush those Philistines. That's not what God says to him. He says, good job. You did it just right. So don't be afraid, because I'm with you, and I will be with you and your whole family. And then Isaac responds by building an altar and calling on the name of the Lord. He's praising God in response to God's protection. One of the things we struggle with as Christians is it's very easy to neglect our specific praise. I think Christians in today's church are usually pretty good at singing the general songs. We love to have praise and worship time, but we're a little ashamed sometimes to credit God with things he's done in our lives. When God comes through on a prayer request, we often want to immediately say, that was probably just a coincidence. I asked God to intervene in those test results, but I don't really want to tell anybody about that, because if I do, they're going to think I'm a little bit nutty. Well, it's probably good for them to think that, because then they're going to say, I should probably ask that person to pray. Because if they think you're crazy enough to come up to them and say, hey, did you know that I prayed about this and then God came through? If they have a prayer need, they're going to say, oh, I do know that one kind of weird person. They might be able to pray for me. But we often neglect our praise and say, there's something else going on. Isaac saw that God had protected him. And so he said, it's time to build an altar. It's time to praise. Isaac wanted to stay there for a while. So what do you think Isaac's going to do when he and his family settle down for any length of time in this chapter?
Dig a well.
That's right. As soon as he goes anywhere, he thinks, you know what I could really use? Another hole in the ground. That'd be really great.
I think he is the man who likes to dig like those big holes in like the beaches. You just see him.
Okay. So it could be that he just likes it. But why would Isaac dig another well when God has just provided the well at Rehoboth that he said, this is the place where God has created room for us? Why does Isaac go over here and dig a well?
Maybe to show future generations, God answered me here, and here's the proof that he did so.
Yeah, I think you're right on it. I think Isaac isn't going to live in Beersheba, but he knows that Beersheba is a special place. He's going to live there for a short while, but he's not going to stay there for a long period of time because he's a nomadic man. But he wants this to be a place where he can say, hey, if you're ever looking for the place to go meet God, when you're going around this hill, there's not a McDonald's I can tell you to turn left at. So turn left at the well, and you'll be right at the spot. He wanted to mark his victory and to remember his praise. Now in Genesis 21, we said God helped Abraham in this same place. And at the end of that help, in Genesis 21:33, we're told, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. So what we see is, both of these men get it. When you have had something really special happen, you need to try to make sure that you remember it and that everyone around you remembers it. And in the ancient world, you're not making a Facebook post about it, right? This is the best you got. Abraham plants a tree. We don't hear anything else about this tamarisk tree, but I bet it was significant to Isaac. I imagine when he was going to Beersheba, he's looking for this tree. Maybe not, but that was my guess. And then when Jacob is going there, I bet he's able to say, hey, my dad dug a well and granddad planted a tree. And that's the spot. These are memorials. They're physical reminders of God's faithfulness. And I think sometimes we miss out on some of that, right? Sometimes we don't realize how significant that would be in our lives. Some people like to write in a journal. Some people might make a piece of art. I don't think I'm very likely to dig a well, but plant a tree, that doesn't sound so bad. If God's done something really special in your life, a physical memorial, probably a pretty good idea. I think it helps so that when you're in a position where you're low again, you can look at that thing, you can maybe be able to touch it and say, hey, God protected me. God came through in this time. Because the way we are, we forget that stuff very, very quickly. Amen. God gives us manna yesterday, and today we say, God, you've never done anything for me. You just will not come through on this. And if you have a physical reminder, if you have something where you can look at it and say, hey, God did that and I've got proof of it, then all of a sudden you can change your whole perspective in faith. Can somebody read verses 26 through 30 for us of chapter 26? It's 26 through 30.
26 through 30?
That's right.
Meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzzath, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, why have you come to me since you were hostile to me and sent me away? They answered, we saw clearly that the Lord was with you, so we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well and sent you away peacefully. And now you are blessed by the Lord. Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank.
All right. So this Philistine king comes up to him right after he's had his time with God, right? Now that has to be frustrating. I don't know about you, but when I have had a really good time on Sunday morning, when I've had a really good prayer time, I can usually forget what's coming next. It's very easy for us to think when you have a great time with God, the next thing is another great time with God. But almost always, some kind of trial. Some kind of trouble is going to be in your way. It might be something physical. It might be just a little argument that you have with somebody in your family. It might be that annoying neighbor comes over and you have to see whether the love of Jesus is really going to come out at that moment. But in those experiences, when we've really been up high with God, all of a sudden, here comes Abimelech. Now, if you're Isaac, is there anyone in the world that you would want to see less than these Philistines? They've come 10 to 15 miles just to see this man that they ran off. Now that is an extremely annoying day, right? You did what they asked. They ran you off with violence. They stole your stuff. They were annoying to the extreme. And here they come, asking for a cup of sugar. And you think, what in the world are we doing here? Where do I need to go for these annoying people to leave me alone? He seems very frustrated. He says, why are you here? You hate me and you ran me off. That's what he asks of the king. Why are you here? I don't want you here. You hate me. He does not say, I hate you. I will point out, he does not say, I hate you, but I bet in his heart he was having a hard time with this man in front of him who is coming up saying, hey, just wanted to come and give you a housewarming gift for all the wells that you gave us. Be great. And so they start out with very pleasing words. We see plainly that the Lord has been with you. And if I'm Isaac, I'm thinking, oh, good grief. What does he want now? How on earth can God expect me to have given up 6 wells, 3 different locations, get the blessing of the Lord, and now this man comes in and he says, hey, just wanted to let you know we noticed how well you're doing. I've never had a conversation with somebody. If they say, I noticed that you're doing really well, there's not a problem coming next. Because usually they're going to say, hey, I'd like to have some of that you're doing so well with too. Maybe the Lord could bless me through you. But somehow his enemies know that he has been blessed by God. Now, how will our enemies know that God has been with us? Okay, the way you carry yourself. Yeah, the way you talk, disposition, yeah. Anything else?
Sometimes they're looking when you think they're not looking.
Yeah. They're noticing things that you wouldn't have guessed.
We could be like him and be making wealth.
Yeah.
I mean,
There could be material wealth, right?
Life might be kind of easy.
Yeah. That definitely brings people around. You see all that anytime that there's somebody that suddenly got wealth, there are going to be people that you've never thought of in 20 years that will show up and say, hey, remember me? What other blessings could show up that people might be able to notice? Children, okay. Yeah. Healing, yeah. I think there's a lot of things, like kind of what we've said of the blessings that Isaac has been promised, that it doesn't have to just be material wealth or material things, but God's blessings should be evident. When we think about God's blessings, sometimes we think, oh, well, when God blesses somebody, it's probably not possible to even know. It's probably just something that's secret. And we shouldn't even talk about our blessings. Nobody should really even notice us because we get nervous about things like Abimelech showing up. But what I think is that God wants you to make it very obvious that he loves you. He doesn't want you to brag. He doesn't want you to live boastfully in any way. But he wants you to say when God has done something special in your life. And that mark should be obvious even if you don't have that conversation, right? Abimelech has found this out 10 miles away. That tells me he's paying very close attention to what Isaac's been doing.
And Isaac probably didn't even know about it.
That's right. He has been right up on this and really wants to know what Isaac is going to do. I think this is supposed to be just like the mark over the doorposts in the Passover, right? It's supposed to be obvious, especially to the people of God. And it's like the mark on the foreheads in Ezekiel chapter 9, where God marks his own people out. What God is doing is making it really clear who his people are. And then Abimelech says, and so we say, let us make a covenant. So he shows up and says, I see that God's blessed you in a really special way. And because he's blessed you, I want to make an agreement. Okay, this is a moment of trial. Now, if your enemies see God's blessing on you, they're going to try this kind of garbage. They're going to show up and they're going to attack you one way or another. But if you rest in God and come near him, they're going to want peace after the attack. Because when a human attacks somebody and they see that it doesn't do anything, they're not stupid. They understand if my best shot did nothing, the next step is to apologize, right? The next step is to say, whoa, I was just kidding around. I didn't really mean to hurt you in any way. It was just kind of part of us in our relationship. You know how we play around. Abimelech tries this after they've done their very best to harm Isaac. And we saw last week that God promised if we plan for peace that we will have his joy. And in verse 29, Abimelech says something almost unbelievable to me, to where if I'm Isaac, I would have a very hard time not having my servants throw this man out of my house. He says, "We have done to you nothing but good." What are you talking about? How could you possibly let that come out of your mouth? There are lies, and then there are statements that are so untrue, you wonder how the person doesn't just turn into ash, right? When they say something that is just so amazingly false, you think, how can a human tongue be allowed to still be moving when it's saying that kind of lie? We've just said Abimelech knows he's blessed. He knows, in fact, he is so blessed, he needs to come 10 miles. So he's been paying very close attention. Abimelech is the king of all the people that have caused all of Isaac's problems. I don't think he has plausible deniability. I don't think he's able to go in there and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize any of this had happened to you." No, I think he's coming in and saying, "We didn't do anything but good to you, and we sent you away in peace. So now let's just have peace." Why would he make such a claim? Why would he lie so ferociously?
Fear.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
Probably trying to cover his butt.
Yeah, I think that's another way of saying it there. That's what I would have done.
Yeah, but why was he trying to cover his butt? He hasn't done no retaliation after the last wells were all done.
Well, I
He's
think
still moving away.
that at some point the bully worries you may swing back. If they're worried that you are getting frustrated enough, I think he's at the point where Isaac has continued to be blessed, continued to be able to accumulate more and more wealth and power, and now somehow he sees the blessing of God on him. I think he's worried. I think he's afraid and thinks this is probably the point where it's going to be enough. And maybe he could even see it in Isaac when he showed up. Maybe when he came up the road and Abimelech's in front of him, Isaac just has that face where you think, "Oh, I probably shouldn't have come this whole journey to see this guy because he's not looking like he's happy to see me." There's no apology and no explanation, just a lie. And when your enemies don't want peace, they're going to try to get their last digs in, right? We all have those experiences where somebody comes with a pretense of peace, where they come in and they say, "Hey, let's get together and we'll really just make this all right." And you get 2 to 3 minutes in that conversation and they're bringing things back up and they're trying to get real personal with it and they're really trying to get right to you. See if they can get you to turn back the other way. I think the temptation for Isaac is to shake his hand, because that's what Abimelech said. He said, "Let's have a covenant that you'll do to us what we did to you." That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? That sounds like a great time. If you're a teenage boy and some guy comes in who's really giving you a hard time and he says, "Let's make an agreement that you'll do to me exactly what I've done to you." All right, buddy. Let's go for it. Let's see if we can't get this arranged today. He could have said, "I'm going to take back my land, my wells, and maybe I want to be the king of the Philistines. Maybe I'm going to be the leader of Gerar." He probably had the power to do so. Abimelech certainly thinks that he did. But instead, Isaac doesn't even seem to acknowledge this foolishness. Man, what a perfect example of the righteous response to those kind of silly people. That is so hard to do, right? When somebody comes in making accusations and lies and they've done all the wrong things and they want to get their final digs in, it is so hard to restrain your mouth. It is so difficult to say, "I am not going to respond to that. I'm just going to continue with the way God wants me to react." How did he respond to their attacks and lies? He made him a feast. What? What kind of crazy reaction? I am doing really well if I can keep my mouth closed when somebody really says something that irritates me. I feel so proud the rest of the day. I will walk around and I'll think, "Oh God, thank you. I am just doing it perfectly. We are so close to one another. We've never been closer." Because if I could keep my mouth closed in that moment, I know it was you. I'm just boasting in it. I'm so thrilled. And then I read this story and I think, man, I'm not even close. Can you imagine that? This jerk shows up having done everything he did. He lies to your face and says, let's have a great agreement. And Isaac says, all right, let's make a great meal. What? How in the world could you do that? Now, thankfully, he has servants, because I'll tell you, if I had to cook for this man, it would not go very well for him. I would really not be able. That's right. I mean, at least hit the salt shaker 3 or 4 times. There's got to be some consequence. But here he is, making a feast. These men hated him. They didn't dispute that. He said, why are you here? You hated me. And Abimelech didn't say, oh, no, that was just a misunderstanding. He says, no, you're blessed of God, so now we don't want to get smushed. But yeah, we hated you. And here he is saying, let's make a feast. Can you think of any other Bible passages that talk about eating around your enemies?
Jesus and Judas Iscariot.
Yeah, Jesus and Judas. And there's one that most people have memorized that jumped to my mind. David. He wrote a psalm that he says,
I prepare a table before you.
yeah, Psalm 23. Almost everybody has at least a paraphrase of that. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now, when you're going through that psalm, sometimes that sounds really good, and sometimes it just sounds crazy, and you think, I don't want to eat around my enemies. Prepare me a table over here with my friends. And God says, no, that's not how my love works. My love isn't for you to hang around your friends. Jesus said that explicitly to his followers in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, if you only greet those who greet you, what reward do you have? And if you only love those who love you, you're not any better than the tax collectors. That's what they do. Jesus said you should go find the people that annoy you and have dinner with them. Oof. That is a mean thing to say, Jesus. I don't like that. It's about to be Thanksgiving. I want my family. I don't want any annoying people. I certainly don't want Abimelech around me. He is super annoying. So God sets the table. He lays out all of the silverware and all the plates, and he's got it sitting there. And then Isaac brings the food. And he wasn't stingy. You know, if I am putting a feast out for my enemy, I'm going to get the saltines, and I'm going to get the pepperonis that have been at the back of the pantry for a while, and I'm going to lay those things out and say, you enjoy that. I don't think that's what Isaac did. Isaac made a feast. I bet he went out there and he found the best of the calves. He found the best of the lambs. He found the best of everything. And he brought it in and said, all right, guys, you enjoy this. And he didn't poison any of it. He saw this man who caused him great trouble, and he embraced him as a friend. And he didn't wait, right? He didn't say, oh, Lord, if you want me to show love to that man, you have him say he's sorry. Because if he says he's sorry, then we'll talk about it. We'll see what we can do. No. Abimelech seems to not do anything except, hey, you give me what I want again. And Isaac says, okay, here we go. We'll do what God's telling me to do. Because sacrificial love reshapes everything around it. That's so hard for us. We understand sacrificial love when we look at Jesus. But when Jesus asks us to sacrifice ourselves, suddenly we plead ignorance. Say, I don't think I can do that, God. You want me to give up what I enjoy for that person? They have messed up everything. And you want me to do something like that? And just like we saw last week, while we were God's enemies, he sent his son. We're told repeatedly that God is love. When you love your enemy as yourself, you're bringing them right to the throne of God. You're saying, hey, here is the love that God gave to me. I want to give it to you. And if you love radically, everything changes because God is present in that love. You're bringing heaven's power into the midst of the darkness. You can't do it alone. But if you rest in God's peace, then suddenly you're able. And I think the key to what happens here with Abimelech is what Isaac did in Beersheba. Because he knew he needed to seek God. He knew he was at a low point. And one of the hardest things that you will find is when you decide you're going to love your enemies on your own. If you think you're going to do that, you're going to be cussing at them before the first bite. Because you won't. You simply cannot be good and loving enough to show those people who have mistreated you the love of God. But if you spend time with God, if you see them coming, you better really get close to God. But your best bet is to be like Isaac. Before you even know Abimelech's coming, you realize how hard it's been, and you better say, God, you have to make this right in me. You have to repair my heart. Because if you're waiting on a person to repair your heart, it's never going to happen. You're going to be disappointed for the rest of your life. If you think that the right apology, the right way of them making it up is going to fix things, you're going to stay disappointed. Because the only one who's going to be able to heal your heart is God. And so if you go to him and you wait on him, he will be there. He has promised it to you. And then you can draw on that peace that God has given you when it's time to give it to your enemies. And so we'll see that's what Isaac does. If somebody can read verses 31 through 33.
31 through 33.
That's 31 through 33, yes.
Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. That day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, "We found water." He called it Sheba, and to this day, the name of the town has been Beersheba.
All right. So the next morning, they swear oaths of peace. Isaac makes no further condition on them. And this isn't an empty promise, in case you think that Abimelech is actually trying to trick him again. An ancient oath is a very serious thing. If you read in ancient history, it is very unlikely for someone to make this kind of oath and then break it. Those kinds of things are written down very carefully because they want to make sure that everyone around knows. And your reputation would have been all that you had. If Abimelech had lied about this, there would be no reason that anyone else in the area would have trusted him. And so Isaac knows, no, if he's swearing this really means it this time. And we're told they departed from him in peace. They aren't any longer trying to take his things. They aren't any longer trying to mess with him. They had no desire to give him peace when they started out. They just wanted to run him off, right? They wanted to make him have a really rough time in his life. But Isaac wanted peace, and God has given it. Now, last week we said that you should do all that you can to make peace. That when people show up and they want to fight you, they want to bother you, they want to do whatever they can, it's your job to do everything in your power to be at peace with them. But it's not your job to actually make the peace. That's God's job. It's really God who gives peace after we plan for it. Proverbs 16:7, I think I'm a slide behind there, sorry about that, tells us when a person's ways please the Lord, he makes even their enemies to be at peace with them. God's telling you that if you will serve him, he'll handle the enemies. If you decide you're going to handle the enemies, you're not going to be pleasing God, and you're not going to have any success. Because when you think you can handle these people, it's never going to end in peace. The solution of wiping them out is not going to give you peace, right? You may think it would. Isaac probably at times during this thought, if I just get rid of all these Philistines that are attacking my herders, I won't have any problems anymore. But what God says is no. If you do that, I'm not going to give you peace. You're not going to have peace inside, even if you have peace outside. Now, apparently, during all this stuff that's been going on, Isaac's been there at Beersheba. He's worshiped God. He's had this covenant with Abimelech. His servants are still digging. Now, that's a pretty tough life. I don't want to be digging for the whole of this negotiation and all the worship time and everything else going on, but you got to get water. And so they're digging and digging and digging until they finally come in and say, hey, we have found water. They say that same day that he has thrown the feast. That's pretty obvious to me what God's showing, right? Isaac's willing to obey God. He's willing to sacrifice his personal animals for his enemies, and then God provides water. I don't know how long these guys had been digging. I'm not telling you that it's a miracle that at that moment the water showed up, but I am telling you that God is in control of the entirety of the universe. And if you want to be frustrated, if you want to be digging a hole for the next 2 weeks when you're trying to find something, oppose God's will for your life. Hear what he tells you to do and say, nah, these guys deserve it. And see how long you're looking for water. But if you're willing to yield, if you're willing to follow the Spirit and obey his commands, it's amazing how many coincidences will start showing up in your life. It's amazing how many accidents of blessing where you'll say, what in the world? How could that happen right now? And God usually won't say a thing. He'll just let you have that Mordecai moment of perhaps it was for such a time as this. That's perhaps why God has done this. Isaac had been blessed with peace, prosperity, and even water earlier. But now he has what his servants found earlier. Earlier they told him, we found living water. And we said, that's what the woman at the well was offered by Jesus in John chapter 5. And yet, here we are where Isaac had found springing water earlier, and now he has drunk from living water. Now he's been in God's presence and has drank from the well of peace. The Lord describes himself again and again as the God of peace. I've got just about half of the references to this name that God claims for himself in the Bible on this slide here. We could fill up another slide of this kind of stuff where God is telling you, I am a peaceful God. He really desires us to be at peace with him and with his enemies, because that whole process of sacrificing our things, his things, so that we may be able to live at peace, transforms them and it transforms us. And don't forget one of the most precious announcements made about Jesus that we're going to hear a whole bunch of times in the next 6 weeks, right? That he is the Prince of Peace. Only that one verse in Isaiah there tells us that Jesus is going to be the Prince of Peace. And the holidays are often going to get busy or crazy, and people are going to hurt you and make you angry. They're going to do things that you wouldn't have ever thought they would do. Some of them are people that you know, and some of them are total strangers. And you're going to be in a position where you think, okay, God, what are we doing here? When somebody shows up and they want to take something out of your cart at the grocery store, is it time to wrestle? Or is it time to pray? When somebody who you barely know comes to the Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner table and they run their mouth, they say totally lying things, is it time to fight? Is it time to pray? When your neighbor's complaining about your parties, maybe you're in his way or maybe they're in your way, you're going to have that same question. Am I going to go to the well of peace? Am I going to be willing to yield what I don't want to? When you drink from the well of peace, you can see those people like Jesus does, right? You're never going to be able to do that if you just walk out there and say, all right, God, I'm going to try my hardest. He knows what that means. You're going to fall on your face every time. But if you stand next to him and say, God, show me what you see. Help me to love them the way that you do. Then he's going to transform everything about your perspective. Plan for peace in advance. Drink from the well of peace and live out your inheritance as a child of the God of peace, who's always faithful to his promises. All right, before we get questions or comments tonight, I do want to say my intention is to move off of this family story for our next 12 weeks, and I intend to study the book of Philippians because it helps me to move a little bit out of Old Testament stuff every now and then and to get a little more directly focused on Jesus. You can see Jesus in every part of the Bible, but every now and then I really want to see Jesus. And when I'm preparing lessons at Christmas time, I don't want to be thinking too much about Genesis, so I'm going to be switching things up. But I've enjoyed our our study of Abraham and Isaac and a little bit of Jacob and Esau. I thank you guys for your faithfulness and kindness. And at that point, if you have any questions or comments about the well of peace or anything that happened tonight.
Can you put it back on that previous
Yep,
slide?
I sure can.
Yeah, so I like how the feast doesn't happen until after he spends time with God, right?
Yeah.
You know, so it's here like, you know, God's just, he's going up to Beersheba because, you know, he's seeking him. He's like, I know God's going to be there. You know, they spend that time. What's really cool is like, God's not telling them, hey, your enemy's about to come.
Yeah.
You should totally feed them. Like, he
Oh,
doesn't
yeah.
say that.
That's
you know?
right.
And so, you know, I believe it's like, because he spent that time humbling himself before God, it made it easier for him to humble himself before his enemy.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, I was reading in Proverbs the other day, and it was talking about how being arrogant leads to destruction, you know, but being humble leads to honor.
Yeah.
You know, and so Isaac had a choice, you know, and it made it easier for him to make that choice because of that time he spent prior to the encounter, you know. And so it just says a lot, like, it's just a good reminder for us who, you know, live in humility
Amen.
to everybody, you know.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point.
When you-
Oh, either one.
I also think that he probably also set a very good example for the rest of his family, like with Jacob and Esau, because now Jacob and Esau are going to tell their children.
Yeah.
And we see even Joseph doing the same thing to his brothers.
Sure.
Even though they hated him, he still showed kindness and love to them in a way that kind of similar to what Isaac did. So
Yeah.
I think this really may have impacted the family as well in a way that we just don't know about.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really great point. Okay. She's got something she wants.
No, I
Oh,
was
okay.
showing her something.
Gotcha. Did you have something you wanted to say, Cheryl?
Well, when you were talking about building altars and wells and trees, I thought about the one that the kids built up front and wondered how many people even know that's what it is. It's
Yeah.
just rocks.
Yeah. I didn't realize what that was either. So you're telling me something.
Yeah, in children's church.
I know there's a bunch of stacked rocks, so I didn't know what that
Don
was.
and Dana had them.
Oh,
I mean, that's their altars, that little stack of rocks. It's
Okay.
at that end.
yeah. I had seen that. I didn't know what it was from, but that's neat. Yeah. I think it's great to have those kind of physical memorials. Anybody else?
Talking about the way God expects us to react to our enemies and treat them. I like something that you and I talked about. I think of David.
Mm-hmm.
If I read it wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. He said, God, come down here
Yeah,
and get rid of my enemies.
that's right.
You didn't expect them in your story.
Yeah, and I think that attitude and David's general inability to control himself on that stuff is directly why God tells him he's not able to build the temple, right? That God tells David, you can't build it because of how violent you've been. So God definitely has a use for violence. I'm not a person who thinks that God doesn't do violent things or order violent things. But when we go over the line, he is very quick to recoil and say, no, that's not what I want you to act like. And I think that pretty soft condemnation, that after all of David's victories, after all the great things he did, that God says, no, you can't build my house. There's too much blood on your hands.
Was he commanding God or was he asking God?
I think
Probably a little of both for David. He took some liberties in the Psalms. He gets pretty aggressive in his language.
he's going through a hard time. And
Oh, yeah.
I kind of see him just venting it to God.
And I mean, David's a great example of the same attitude as Isaac when he has Saul in his hands, right? He could have killed him multiple times and instead says, no, God doesn't want me to do this. So I don't mean to say that David didn't do the right thing ever, just that in the end, God says, look, towards the end of your life, you went the wrong way.
I think he even gave one of Jonathan's sons, one of the last descendants of Saul.
Yeah.
He says, we're going to take care of you, and also here's a feast.
Yeah, Mephibosheth. He's one of my favorite biblical characters. He's really great. Anybody else? All right, well, who will close us out in prayer?